Hello, I'm Nick Spencer, and you're listening to a new series of Reading Our Times, the podcast about books, about ideas about us. This series, we're looking at playing God, science, religion, and the future of humanity. We're going to be talking about scientific immortality, alien life, animal personhood, the rise in mental ill health, and the soul of AI. And underlying it all, we're going to be thinking about the question that lies at the heart of Reading Our Times. How are we to understand our human condition? How much is a human life worth? No, don't respond to that. I suspect I know your answer already. Infinite. Priceless. You cannot put a value on human life, let alone a monetary one. But we do, all the time. Indeed, we have to. From agreeing insurance to paying for medical treatment, from giving money to charity to paying out criminal injury compensation. We put a price on life all the time. We just don't like to admit it. So, how much is a life worth? What criteria do we use to come to that figure? And who gets to decide? Jenny Kleeman is a journalist and author, and her latest book looks at this question from a number of different angles. It's called The Price of Life, In Search of What We're Worth and Who Decides, and Jenny joins me on the podcast this week. Jenny, welcome to Reading Our Times.
Thank you so much for having me.
You cover 12 different areas in the book, ranging from the chilling to the tragic. And although I'd really like to cover them all in our conversation, I want us to home in on those that I think expose some of the most profound ethical questions. And the first of them is really the very fact of calculating the value of a life. Thanks to COVID-19, you point out we're more familiar with cost-benefit analyses. But as you point out, this is pretty much bread and butter for the NHS and for NICE, and the whole question of publicly funded medicine. So I guess my first question is, give us some examples of where this happens as a matter of course, and if you can, work into that answer what a QALY is.
Well, there are many ways that the price of life is calculated as a matter of course, particularly when it comes to the price of saving a life. So as soon as you decide that any potentially life-saving intervention is too expensive, and that could be extra lifeboats on the Titanic, or it could be a particular child-proof cap on a bottle of bleach, it could be a product recall on a faulty fridge that is likely to catch fire. But as soon as you decide there is a risk of people dying, but actually it would be very expensive to mitigate that risk, so we're not going to spend that money. When you do that, you are putting a price on life, because you are saying what the limits are of what you would spend, and that limit is the price on life. And of course, the NHS and NICE do this all the time when they're deciding which life-saving interventions they're going to fund, be those medicines or other forms of medical treatment. So the NHS, or rather NICE, who decides which treatments should be recommended to be available on the NHS, has this figure, which is £20,000 to £30,000 per quality adjusted life year it will provide to a person. And so that means that the NHS will pay for something if it will provide a year of life in good health that costs no more than £20,000 to £30,000. So a QALY is a measure of the kind of goodness of life, of whether or not you're not just living, but living well. And this is a sum that NICE has used ever since its inception in the late 90s. And when I was writing the book, I was really interested to know, where does this number come from, this £20,000 to £30,000 a year sum? And I'd imagined that there would be some assessment of like budgets and the number of people who use the NHS, like the Department of Health gives the NHS X amount a year, and there are X million service users, and you do some maths, and this is where this number comes from. And it turns out that this number is kind of plucked out of the air, that ever since the late 90s, NICE has used this £20,000 to £30,000 benchmark. But they say that that doesn't really matter. The point is to have some sort of standard that you use as a token so that you can compare different interventions for different diseases, different illnesses, and allow you to compare things which aren't alike as if they were alike for like a cancer drug or a gene therapy. You can compare them by looking at how many years of life in good health would it give per person.
So it's an artificial measure that effectively allows comparison between very different conditions and very different people. So an example would be whether you're giving a particular drug to a young person who might have 60, 70 years, 80 years of life ahead of them of good health compared to a middle-aged person, older person who would have poorer life chances, but also poorer experience of life as a result of the drug, right?
Yes. And that's how it works in theory. But when you actually drill down into it, there are exceptions. So a drug that will give you an extra year of life at the end of your life, they're prepared to spend a little bit more on, because NICE have decided that you might value your life more if you know that you have less of it. So they will spend more on treatments for terminal conditions that can give you a bit more life at the end. But yes, that is the general idea behind all of it.
Do you get a sense that the people who are responsible for making these decisions at NICE, the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, isn't it?
Yeah.
Are they squeamish? Or as far as they're concerned, it just comes with the territory now, they've got to do it?
They're very different to me. They have a kind of background in health economics. So they're very adept at looking at things in abstraction, looking at numbers on spreadsheets. And in fact, the person I interviewed for the book was talking about, we're giving away health in one area to another area. So they're not actually looking at the faces of people. They're not listening to individual stories. They are weighing up numbers on a spreadsheet. And that's necessary, I think. We do need to have people in the world who think that way, because the price of life is, in some respects, about fairness. And you need to be dispassionate to be fair, particularly when you're dealing with enormous budgets like the NHS. But it can be a bit alarming if you are someone who is used to people and stories to rub up against a system which is all to do with where you fit on a spreadsheet. Because, of course, there are people at the margins every time. There are people who are a little bit too old to qualify for a certain drug, or people for whom the life-saving drug is a little bit too expensive. And it is very painful if you happen to fall in the wrong column on that spreadsheet.
Yes. But there's also quite a profound tension, I think, that runs through the book here, which is that on the one hand, that quantification is necessary. If you're going to save lives, you've got to do it. And on the other hand, humans are quintessentially attached, emotional, empathic creatures. So character-wise, I think I'm on your side of that particular kind of natural divide. But I don't think it's necessarily a matter of character. I think there's quite a profound tension going on there, isn't there? There
is, absolutely. And for me, I started out investigating this, feeling repelled by the idea that people put prices on lives. And then through the course of doing it, realising the harm that's done if you're not prepared to ask these dispassionate questions, that you end up making decisions that you never intended to make and coming to conclusions you never wanted to come to if you shy away from asking these difficult questions. So I'm certainly someone now who really believes that you should be prepared to ask these questions. You just shouldn't necessarily be beguiled by the numbers, and you should see them for what they are, which is they're a tool that helps you illuminate certain things about how we're living, what we value, but they do not tell you who is valuable and what is valuable. And you shouldn't be beguiled into thinking that they represent anything to do with real value.
Yes. And like most tools, we've got to make sure we use it rather than allowing the tool to change us. We'll come back to that with one of my favourite chapters. Before we do, I want to talk about the arbitrary nature of this, because that's one of the other things that leapt out for me. Now, staying with QALYs, there's a degree of arbitrariness in QALYs, not simply based on the kind of the inevitable value judgment of the quality of life, but between countries, isn't there? Not all countries have the same QALY values, do they?
There's a huge difference between countries. So in America, you're not allowed to talk about QALYs because that goes against their principles of the idea that you will cap what you will spend. And yet there is a kind of implicit QALY in terms of what insurers will spend. And I think Americans spend more per quality adjusted life year. But then there's a vast range of difference all over the world. And it's got nothing to do with actually how wealthy a country is, that actually some developing countries will value a QALY as much higher than we do in the UK. So it varies very, very widely according to where you are in the world.
Do you get any indication of what might be underlying that variation? Are certain cultures more likely to have a higher QALY than others?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I think there is a symbiosis between the pharmaceutical industry and what a QALY is in a given country, because each country negotiates its own licenses and agreements for certain drugs. So the big drug manufacturers, Pfizer, Novartis, they know that if they're going to be selling a drug in the UK, they know how to price it and they know what they need to work around. And although they might have a list price for a drug, the actual sum that they agree to provide it to the NHS for might be quite different. So I think part of that comes from what any given pharmaceutical company is prepared to price their drugs at in a given country as well.
Yeah. If there's a degree of arbitrariness in the QALY figure between different countries, it is nothing compared to the arbitrariness between just the value that very different situations end up putting on lives. And this comes out particularly in your chapter on criminal injury compensation and the well-known but always shocking and always upsetting story of the terrorist attack on London Bridge and Southwark Market in 2017, I think it was.
Yes.
Just give us a little bit of background about what happened there.
What happened was that 3 terrorists drove a van over London Bridge and mowed down pedestrians on London Bridge. They killed 2 people on London Bridge. Then they crashed the van at the top of Borough Market, and they got out of the van and they killed 6 more people by stabbing them. They stabbed actually quite a lot of people, but 6 people were killed with knives. So 8 people were killed in total in that particular attack. And they came from very different countries. So there were, I think, 3 French people who were killed. There was a Spanish person, 2 Australians, a British person and a Canadian person killed. So I used this as an example in the book because I thought it would be an illuminating example because they all came from different countries. And you could show how criminal injury compensation is incredibly arbitrary and unfair depending on where the victim happens to live, what their passport is. I looked into this knowing that in the UK, the statutory criminal injury compensation for a life lost in violent crime is £11,000. So if you're murdered, your family will be given £11,000, which seems a very strange figure because what do you do with that money? It's not big enough to really help you, but it's also not small enough for you to ignore and say, that was nothing.
Yes.
So it's not nothing, but it's really not something.
Yes.
It's a very strange figure. Whereas the Spanish victim who was stabbed, his family would have got €250,000. And the French victims, their families would have been compensated according to what their relation was to the victim. So mothers of victims get a certain amount, children of victims get a certain amount, which I think is actually more fair because you're being compensated for your grief rather than for a price being put on the life taken. But when I actually looked into this properly, and I was really shocked because I was in the middle of reporting it for the book, it wasn't something that I expected to find, but I discovered that the 2 people who were killed by the van on London Bridge, their families were able to sue Hertz, who are the rental company that provided the van. And their families would have been entitled to about £1.5 million in compensation, whereas the people who were stabbed by the same terrorists seconds later would only have been eligible for statutory compensation. So the British victim, his family would have got £11,000. Which is just extraordinary.
Isn't it?
It's just so,
It really
so
is.
Incredibly unfair. It is manifestly wrong. And so here is an example of how the price of life can be really useful, comparing the price of life, because it is a tool for showing injustice and for showing systems that do not work. So, yeah, I was sitting where I am now when I found that out. I found this blog on an insurance website where somebody was discussing this, and I thought, how can this be true? And then I spoke to the lawyers involved and it is true. But also, how can there not be outrage about this? How can it not be widely known?
And the logic there, such as there isn't any logic there, is that Hertz or any car, van hire company has a certain insurance policy in place which protects them against criminal use of their vehicles or just death by use of their vehicles.
Just being in an accident. It has a policy in place where the person driving, if they happen to kill somebody with the vehicle, they're covered. And criminal injury compensation is there for when there is no other recourse. So you go for the government compensation when there is nobody that you can sue or nobody else that you can appeal to. And you can't sue knife manufacturers for producing knives. So there's no one to sue. So you just go for the statutory compensation.
And also, as I picked up in that chapter, you can't sue gun manufacturers or gun makers in the US, even if their guns are used at a mass shooting. I mean, I didn't imagine that would be the case in America, but I would have thought that might have helped these awful mass shootings in the US if the people who are supplying the guns to the people who are using them might feel a bit legally responsible for them. But that's not happening, is it?
Not at all. It's part of the gun protections in the US that you can't sue gun manufacturers. You can sue, though, the premises on which a mass shooting takes place, which is one of the interesting things that I found, that the victims of the Las Vegas shooting, their families would have been able to get really quite healthy sums because the Las Vegas shooting took place from the window of a luxury hotel, which was part of a very large chain of hotels. And the shooter in that atrocity had investigated shooting people from the top of a cliff or from an Airbnb. And if he had done it that way, there would have been no one for the families to sue. If he'd shot people from the top of a cliff on a beach, those families would have got absolutely nothing. But because he happened to do it where he did, their families would have got millions of dollars in payout. It's ridiculously arbitrary.
That's very arbitrary, isn't it? And I guess whilst we're on the topic of being arbitrary, the clearest message that came through from the headline numbers that are in each of your chapters is that, if we think qualities are a bit arbitrary and criminal injury compensation is a bit arbitrary, the overall price values in your chapters are astonishing. So on the one extreme, you give an example of people being sold into slavery in, I think it was Libya, costing $400. And yet in your chapter, when you visit Lockheed Martin factory making F-35s, the figure you come to is quite arbitrary, but it could be $400 million per life. So there's an absolutely enormous range there, isn't there?
Absolutely enormous, ridiculous range. And that was what was so interesting is at the end of putting all the numbers together and seeing what they mean, that some of the cheapest and the most expensive lives are in the same country, in that you can buy an Afghan bride for $500, but the most expensive lives ever taken were the ones taken in Afghanistan by F-35s when they had killed Taliban warlords. It's quite ridiculous. And also to do with the slavery chapter, the idea that in Libya you can buy a slave for $400, but cadavers, dead bodies, are sold for medical research for $5,000 in the US. So actually the bodies of slaves are worth more than 10 times as much as they are alive. It's quite extraordinary.
Yeah. Yes, and I can see, as you say, when you start investigating these issues, it sends shivers down your spine and makes your stomach churn a bit. I want to focus particularly on the philanthropy chapter, because this was the one that really helped crystallise the argument for me. Now, you make the point that healthcare decisions for NICE are not simply based on a utilitarian idea of justice. But there is a chapter in the book where that very much is at the forefront, and this is on philanthropy, and in particular philanthropy as it's practiced in Silicon Valley. I guess the first question has to be effective altruism. Tell us what it is.
It is a philosophy, an approach to doing good, which urges people to treat altruism in a scientific manner. So to maximise the number of lives saved or demonstrably improved per dollar or pound you spend. And it is trying to cleave away emotion out of giving. And the thinking is you should not allow charities to pull at your heartstrings. You shouldn't give money to a cancer charity because your mother died of cancer. You shouldn't be moved by a television appeal of a starving orphan in the aftermath of an earthquake. You should be thinking, how can I get the most out of the money that I've got to give away? You should be giving away as much as you can, and you should be giving away as effectively as possible. And it is morally wrong for you to be giving your money away ineffectively when you could be saving more lives for your money, which is a kind of appealing approach, I guess, at first, which is to try and save as many lives as possible and improve as many lives as possible. But it requires you to park your empathy, to not look at what you can see with your eyes in terms of visible victims, and to turn everything really into quantitative things that can be compared.
So in that spectrum we were talking about, or that tension we were talking about earlier in our conversation between a highly quantitative approach to this, which looks at the numbers and crunches through those, and a much more empathic and attachment-based understanding of human value. This is very much right at the end of that particular spectrum, isn't it? It's heavily utilitarian. It draws on the work of Peter Singer. It's also anti-speciesist as well, isn't it? Is that right?
Yes.
So it doesn't suggest we should make a effective distinction between humans and other,
Yes.
so higher primates, for example.
Yes, so all lives are equal. Human, animal, lives alive today, lives in the future, which leads to some very unusual decisions being made. For example, I went to talk to the people who are giving away the money of Dustin Moskovitz, who was number 2 in Facebook, was Mark Zuckerberg's roommate, has $11 billion to give away. And they have a farm animal welfare program, or they have an animal welfare program, but their farm animal welfare program focuses on chickens. Their animal welfare program is much more likely to focus on fish than cows, because if you're looking at brute numbers of lives saved, one cow dies and can make, I don't know how many burgers, I calculated it in the book, something like 100 burgers, whereas, you need to kill 6 sardines to fill a tin. So that's more lives. So you're focused on smaller creatures if you're looking at numbers of lives. And also when you're looking at long-termism, which is what they call it, lives in the future, there are potentially billions of human lives that you can save if you are making certain interventions in the present that will prevent the annihilation of the human race. So if it's constantly a numbers game, it takes you to quite strange places, or rather, well, not strange, but places that are quite alien to the way that we think now if we're thinking about saving lives.
I mean, I don't mean this to sound facetious, but I've often wondered how that mindset encounters or deals with the fact that, bacteria and viruses are alive, aren't they? I mean, lots of the parasites that kill people, mosquitoes are alive. I mean, they don't weigh those at the same value as you would do a higher primate or a human.
I think they've thought about that, and they think about sentience and sort of ability to suffer and ability to feel pain, and they would say perhaps that mosquitoes and bacterium don't suffer or feel pain. But how they know that is another question.
Well, exactly. That's quite a qualitative thing, isn't it? That rubs against the quantitative approach.
Suffering is a qualitative thing, sure.
Yeah. So you can absolutely see why this approach appeals to that kind of Silicon Valley mentality. They could come up with things that were chilling. I mean, I think my peak value is the death of an 8-year-old, was the phrase of one of them. What's going on there?
He was talking about having plotted on a graph when's the worst time to die, because obviously they need to think about when is the most effective time for them to intervene, to make a philanthropic intervention. Is it worse if a newborn baby dies than if a mother supporting a family dies? And he had worked out actually the worst time to die is when you're 8, because then you have a large number of qualities ahead of you, but you've also made meaningful connections in your life that mean that your death would affect people around you. Whereas a newborn baby, that might affect its parents, but it's not embedded in the community such that it will disrupt a large number of lives. And actually that is just one of many examples of this very, very cold calculus that they are willing to employ in order to make their decisions.
Yes, I mean, I can understand the logic to that, but enough make me feel queasy. But here's the rub with this particular chapter. San Francisco, more millionaires and more homeless people than pretty much anywhere else in the US. And you write at one point, I appreciate that it takes a certain kind of moral courage to be dispassionate enough to have these conversations. But is it a good kind of courage? Can you save more of humanity if you're prepared to have them, or does this way of thinking require you to deny your own humanity? And implicit in you asking that question is that it does a bit, doesn't it?
Whenever I go to American cities, I'm always shocked by the manifest desperation of homeless people on the streets. But it is so bad in San Francisco that you have people in mental health crisis, drug addicted people, really living on the streets in homeless camps. And I was literally walking around them, stepping over them to get to the offices of these philanthropic foundations. And I can understand rationally why spending your charitable money on these people might not seem like a very good bet. But it did seem extraordinary to me that these people are giving away billions of dollars to children in Africa because those are the cheapest lives to save, and not thinking there is something very wrong about the world in which I am a beneficiary that I could be using my money to try and solve. And it really shocked me, that dissonance that they were able to kind of carry within their own heads whilst doing all of this. And I think anything that requires you to switch off your own empathy is a little bit dangerous.
And that's the key, I think. It's so much to do with what kind of creature we are. Because if we were simply utility-based, calculating organisms that evaluated the overall good of a situation by the amount of pleasure as opposed to the amount of pain or something like that, then that kind of Silicon Valley effective altruism approach seems to make sense. But fundamentally, we're not that creature. We're creatures who form attachments and who recognise there is a good in an attachment and the good through the empathy. And I was deeply struck by your passing comment that William MacAskill, who's the Oxford academic who's behind effective altruism, decided not to have children for rational cost-benefit reasons.
Well, he would say for him they're not a good because he can do so much good in the world by being a leader of EA. I mean, he's not saying that people shouldn't have children. He's just saying that for him it wouldn't be a good idea. I mean, for me, all of this comes down to how do you define doing good? Is it about brute number of lives saved or improved, or is it about creating the world you want everybody to live in? And for me, it is the latter, and anything that is about saving lives but that means that you are contributing to a world where there is still great unfairness isn't a good solution. And I think we give money away because we want the world to be a better place rather than because we're looking at a spreadsheet of lives saved and improved.
But better hoovers up the ideas of empathy and commitment and love and attachment rather than simply survival, right?
Yes, rather than simply a binary dead, alive or health improved. It also means that it skews the choices in favour of things that you can measure, like does this person have malaria or infant mortality, rather than is their education better? Are they getting a better quality education? Are they happier? All of these things. I mean, you can measure happiness. They would say you can measure happiness. But I'm sure people who give money away in this way would be much more likely to be drawn to things where there are outcomes that you can quantify. And so, yes, number of mosquito nets distributed, number of deworming tablets provided.
And it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because no one in their right mind argues against distributing mosquito nets or deworming tablets. It's just the idea that everything gets subsumed into that cost-benefit analysis, as you intimate, seems to leave out so much.
Yes, and also the two things that are concerning about all of this is, one, the idea that it's morally wrong to not maximise the number of lives saved or improved for your money, and that it's somehow unevolved to be thinking that way. And the other thing is that some of the richest people in the world are giving their money away according to these principles, and these people have enormous wealth that comes in large part from their ability to avoid paying tax in many cases.
Yes.
And, you know, we can vote on how tax dollars are spread around the world, but we have no say in how this money is given away. And this has enormous potential implications in terms of how it could change the world if this money is being poured in one direction as opposed to another. And there is a kind of narcissism in this, that a lot of these incredibly rich people think that they are rich because they're really good at making decisions and solving problems. And perhaps they are, but they think that they are perhaps better equipped to solve problems than governments that we vote for.
Yeah.
And so it was more that this is quietly going on without us really knowing it or voting for it.
And avoiding a lot of public scrutiny as well, which is very important.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, that issue touches on another one that I want to pick up, which is that of moral progress. Now, bear with me with this question because hopefully it'll become clear what I'm getting at here. You mentioned William MacAskill thinking that our moral instinct developed at a time when we couldn't have a global impact. And now that we're stuck with a myopic view of how to do good, our morality is primitive, you remark him saying. There are several examples in the book of reports putting money on injuries and lives. You mentioned the Home Office research report on the economic and social consequences of crime, which measure everything from a chipped tooth to a dislocated joint to murder. And then in your chapter on criminal injury, you talk about guidelines for the assessment of general damages in criminal injury cases. Many, many, many years ago, I read history at university, and as a result of that, I read the very first law codes in Anglo-Saxon England, Ethelbert's law codes in the early 7th century. Here's a couple of lines from it. If both bones should be broken, one should compensate with 20 shillings. If a shoulder is made lame, one should compensate with 30 shillings. If either ear is made deaf, one should compensate with 25 shillings. It struck me as extraordinarily similar to the kind of Home Office reports and criminal injustice guidelines that you write about, which kind of undermines the idea of moral progress. Did you have a sense from all your interviews of us being morally more advanced or more progressive than might have been the case in the past?
Not at all. And I think
nice and straightforward.
I think the difference is that now we don't talk about it. It's not really explicit. You have to dig to find the Home Office figures and even the criminal injury compensation tariffs. They're there, but you have to really look for them. They're not things that people really talk about because it's, particularly if you're British, it's a bit gross, isn't it, to put a figure on all of this. And yet it's still happening. That doesn't mean to say that it shouldn't happen. I mean, I very much believe, having written this book, I really believe in criminal injury compensation. I really think that you shouldn't be left out of pocket if something terrible beyond your control happens to you in a civilized society. But we should be able to have proper open conversations about the levels of compensation and whether or not they're fair. Because as I say in the book, when they're not fair, we, the public, probably end up paying anyway through charitable donations. So we do end up paying anyway. So yeah, I don't think there has been very much moral progress. And I think actually the current system is extraordinarily unfair, and particularly when you're looking at criminal injury compensation, not just to do with how you're killed, but the current tariffs haven't been updated or adjusted for inflation since 2012, which is really terrible. So if we're going to have any system like that, it needs to work and it needs to be a good system. You know, I don't really think we have made much moral progress at all. I think we have quite a good intuitive moral sense, which the effective altruist would say that that's bad, that our kind of intuition is bad. And in fact, in order to make moral progress, we need to be scientific about how to do good. I do think effective altruism has a lot to contribute in terms of shining a light on ineffective charities, or rather refusing to shine the light of their donations on ineffective charities. There are a lot of charities that waste money or could spend it better. And we should constantly be encouraging charities to do whatever they can to siphon as much money as possible towards their causes. I don't know if moral progress, though, would come from applying the scientific method to doing good.
Yes. I want to ask you about your humanity in all this. A couple of quotations from earlier on in the book. You say, when it comes to discussing the price of a murdered life, it feels callous, inhuman and abhorrent. In your conclusion, the more I investigate the price of saving a life, the more comfortable I am with questions that initially repelled me. How has this changed you?
Oh, gosh, it really changed me. There's a point in the COVID chapter where I was having a discussion with Peter Singer. I was really surprised that he was pro-lockdown, because I would have thought that he would say the harm caused to young people couldn't be justified by the number of lives saved by lockdown. And then he said to me, yeah, but you know, it's very difficult to compare the harm or to quantify the harm done to young people and compare it to the number of lives saved. And I was like, oh, yes, of course. Yeah, you're quite right. And then I thought, gosh, you know, I would have felt so uncomfortable having these conversations only a few months ago. And now I'm just taking it in my stride. I found it on a personal level incredibly uncomfortable because, of course, the way the book works is I'm taking extremely personal, human, qualitative stories as a way of elucidating the quantitative. And that, in some cases, involved speaking to bereaved parents and telling them about sums of money put on their child's life, which is grotesque and awful. And I felt really uncomfortable doing it. But I was very clear with all my interviewees from the start about what I was doing and why I was doing it and the benefit of doing it. But yeah, I felt incredibly uncomfortable. I think the day you stop feeling uncomfortable about presenting a bereaved person with a bill for the the cost of their child's death is the day that you've really lost an important part of yourself.
Yeah. And that is a microcosm of this wider question. Because as you say, if you truly, in the introduction, if you truly value a life, it can't be priceless. And as you said there, the effective altruism movement is helpful. It does concentrate the mind. It makes you think these things through. And yes, of course, we want our donations to be more rather than less effective. We want to do more good rather than less good. But at the same time, you know, if you look at the legal system, there's been a tremendous move to getting victims in court, recognising the deep, incommensurably powerful personal element in all these stories, which doesn't fit with the quantitative approach and is in danger of being lost by that quantitative approach. And it's kind of squaring that circle. It strikes me as very, very difficult.
It's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but you're quite right that the whole having victim impact statements when a judge is ruling on a sentence, for example, the fact that we recognise that it's not just pure facts and details, but actually emotions are incredibly important and that they come into play. And the impact of something isn't just felt in terms of people's pockets, but in terms of lives changed. The fact that that is such a big thing in court shows that we do still value that and recognise that. I just worry that we are already in this very data-driven world where metrics matter so much. And I worry that numbers are going to come to be even more powerful than they are now. And the qualitative is going to be squeezed out simply because it's less useful for algorithms.
Yeah. And also simply built into it. You know, the numbers often think for us. There are assumptions built into those numbers, which if we don't examine, mean that almost the conclusion is pre-decided by the assumptions.
Yes, absolutely. Numbers are a shortcut that you think the worth of something is measured by its likes and views and whatever, which is just not the case at all. So yes, I worry that our kind of systems of processing things and of understanding knowledge and of going forward, because they are so automated now, are just going to lean towards that, the quantitative rather than the qualitative.
Reading Our Times is a podcast about books, about ideas, about us. So my concluding question is, what does what we've been talking about, what you researched the book, what does that say to you about the human condition, about who we are?
Human beings use tools to understand the world and to improve it. And we use the price of life as a tool. It is a really useful tool in some respects. It's a really useful tool for showing injustice. It's a useful tool for showing if our actions are leading us to do things that we never intended to do. But we have to make sure that we are using the tools and the tools are not using us. And in a world where we are increasingly beguiled by numbers, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that the prices we put on lives are indices, they're tools, they're not real prices. And as we move into a world where the prices that are put on our lives are going to become ever more specific, ever more accurate, ever more related to who you specifically are, we need to interrogate those numbers, but also be aware that all they are is just a metric that's telling us that that it's just one of many data points, and that the quality of things matters, and empathy is a tool that is essential to human beings as well. So we need to recognise the fact that we live in communities, that we aren't just all little bags of numbers and data, and that our sense of human value doesn't come from numbers.
The book is called The Price of Life, In Search of What We're Worth and Who Decides. Jenny Kleeman, thank you very much indeed for speaking to Reading Our Times.
Thank you so much.
Next week, I'll be speaking to David Brooks about his book, How to Know a Person.
Beholding is just an appreciative way of being aware of some person's whole flow of their being. And I mentioned this episode to some friends of mine who were older, and they said, yeah, that's what we do with our grandkids. We just behold them. And so it's just enormous joy to be able to behold someone and really feel I get the sense of who they are.
You've been listening to Reading Our Times from the think tank Theos. It's produced by Phil Bodger. Our team includes Daniel Turner, Fiona Hanscom and Chinny MacDonald. Special thanks to Nina Humphreys, who composed our theme tune and all the music. You can subscribe to Reading Our Times on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and you can also find us on the website theosthinktank.co.uk. We're going to be doing a few live events at festivals in the coming months, so please sign up to the Theos monthly newsletter and join us in person for those if you can. And don't forget to rate and review the podcast on iTunes. It'll help other people find it. Goodbye.